Holden Barrett was mopping the emergency hallway when the group of young doctors started laughing. He had paused near the VIP wing, eyes fixed on the small observation window, watching the breathing pattern of Senator Preston Tate, with the kind of stillness that belongs to men who have seen people die. "Does the janitor want to make a diagnosis?" One of them sneered, loud enough for the whole corridor to hear. Holden said nothing. He tightened his grip on the mop handle and kept watching. 10 minutes later, every protocol they had would fail, and the man they laughed at would be the only one in the room who knew why. If you love stories where arrogance meets its answer, stay right here. This one earns every second of it. The night shift at St. Marloe Medical Center started at 11 and ended when the light through the frosted lobby windows turned gray. Holden Barrett had worked that shift for 2 years without missing a single day. He knew every corner of the building, which tile near the radiology wing had a loose edge, which elevator door hesitated before closing, which hallway smelled of antiseptic versus floor wax. He moved through the hospital like water moves through a familiar channel, quietly, steadily, without friction. The other janitors sometimes asked why he always took the hardest floors, the emergency wing, the ICU corridor, the surgical prep hallway. He never gave them a full answer. He just said he preferred to stay busy. His routine was precise. He arrived early, signed in with a nod to whoever was at the front desk, collected his cart, and disappeared into the building's rhythm. The nurses on the night shift had learned to work around him. A few of them nodded when he passed. Most of the doctors didn't notice him at all, which was exactly how he preferred it. He wore the gray uniform with the St. Marloe logo on the chest, kept his head down, and made sure every surface he touched was cleaner than he found it. There was a small notebook in his shirt pocket, the kind with a soft cover and narrow lines. He wrote in it sometimes. Short notes, a word or two, nothing that would mean anything to a stranger who found it. What those strangers would not have known was that the notes were observations. A patient in room 14, whose chart showed normal vitals, but whose posture suggested something else. A resident who asked the wrong follow-up question during rounds. A medication order posted in the hallway that didn't match what Holden remembered hearing the attending physician say 3 hours earlier. He never reported these things. He never said anything to anyone. He had learned the hard way that saying things led to consequences he was no longer willing to carry. His daughter, Maisie, was 7 years old and had a drawing she made every week taped to the refrigerator at home. Some weeks it was a dog, some weeks a castle, some weeks a version of Holden himself rendered in crayon, with enormous hands and a wide smile. He kept every one of them in a folder on the kitchen shelf. He made her breakfast every morning before school, packed her lunch in the same insulated bag with the blue zipper, and picked her up every afternoon when his shift ended. That rhythm, the breakfast, the lunch, the pickup, was the architecture of his life now, and he protected it with everything he had. The hospital was just the place in between. He told himself that often enough that he almost believed it. Senator Preston Tate arrived at St. Marloe Medical Center on a Thursday morning in October, 2 days before the Regional Health Policy Conference that the hospital had spent 4 months organizing. The senator was a tall man in his early 60s, broad-shouldered and still carrying the posture of someone who had once played college football, though his face showed the particular softening that comes from decades of fundraising dinners and committee hearing. He was there for a pre-conference medical checkup, a standard procedure that his communications staff had quietly arranged to avoid any headlines about his health, going into a critical budget vote the following month. The hospital had agreed without hesitation. Celeste Mercer, the hospital's executive director, had personally overseen the arrangements. She was a precise woman who spoke in sentences that sounded rehearsed even when they weren't, and she had spent considerable energy in the preceding weeks, ensuring that every detail of the senator's visit would be seamless. The VIP suite on the 4th floor had been refreshed with new linens. The catering order for the conference's opening reception had been revised twice. The security clearance protocols for the senator's advance team had been processed without a single delay. Celeste had told her department heads in a meeting 3 days prior that St. Marlo's reputation had been built on moments exactly like this one, and she intended to use it. Dr. Sterling Quinn had been assigned to lead the senator's medical team. He was 44 years old, had completed his residency at one of the most competitive programs in the country, and carried himself with the deliberate confidence of a man who considered every room he entered to be improved by his presence. He had requested the assignment himself, framing it to Celeste as a matter of institutional preparedness. What he did not say aloud, though several of his colleagues understood it clearly, was that proximity to a senator carrying a major healthcare budget vote was not something any ambitious department chief would leave to chance. Sterling Quinn had arrived at St. Marlo 5 years ago with a reputation and had spent every day since then reinforcing it. The senator's visit was, in his thinking, another piece of that structure. The morning of the checkup, the 4th floor was quiet and carefully controlled. The regular nursing staff had been supplemented by 2 additional technicians. The corridor near the VIP suite had been cleared of routine traffic. Holden Barrett had been quietly rerouted to the floors below. Nobody told him why. Nobody thought to. The first time they laughed at him was early on a Tuesday, 2 days before Senator Tate's condition would turn critical. Holden had been working the 4th floor corridor, running his mop across the stretch of linoleum between the nurses' station and the VIP wing, when he overheard 2 of the nurses talking in low voices near the supply closet. They were discussing the senator's intake notes, not loudly, not carelessly, just the kind of practical exchange that happens between people who have too much to do and not enough time to do it quietly. One of them mentioned a detail about the senator's recent medication history. Holden kept moving his mop, but his pace slowed by about half a step. He paused near the window at the end of the hall, the one that looked into the corridor adjacent to the VIP suite, and watched for a moment. He could see the outline of the senator through the interior glass, seated in a chair near the bed, speaking with an aide. What Holden noticed was not dramatic. It was the kind of small, quiet anomaly that only registers in a person trained to watch for it. A subtle asymmetry in the way the senator was holding his left arm, a particular quality to the way he blinked. Holden stood there for perhaps 20 seconds. That was when he heard the laughter. 3 young residents, coming down the hall, just finishing their rounds, still carrying the easy energy of people who had not yet learned to be careful with it. One of them saw Holden standing at the window and said something to the other 2. The tallest one, the one with the white coat that still looked new, said it loud enough that the nurses at the station heard it. "Careful. Boys, the janitor's running diagnostics." They all laughed. It was not cruel laughter exactly, just the kind that assumes its target has no interior life worth considering. Holden turned around slowly. He looked at the 3 of them. He said nothing. He reached into his shirt pocket, touched the edge of his small notebook, and then pulled his hand back without taking it out. He returned to his mop. The residents kept walking. From the nurse's station, a woman named Laurel Hayes watched the whole thing. She had been at St. Marlo for 6 years, and she was not a person who laughed at things like that. She looked at Holden's face as he went back to work and thought there was something there she couldn't quite name. Later that same afternoon, Holden passed Dr. Sterling Quinn in the hallway outside the fourth-floor utility closet. He was pushing his cart toward the service elevator when Sterling stopped him. Not to speak to him exactly, more to look at him the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has been moved slightly out of position. "The VIP wing isn't part of your assigned section," Sterling said. It wasn't a question and it wasn't a reprimand. It was a reminder of category. Holden nodded once and continued to the elevator. Sterling watched him go with the particular expression of a man who had just resolved something. The story Holden Barrett did not tell anyone at St. Marloe Medical Center. Not during his interview, not on any form he filled out, not in any conversation he had with any coworker over 2 years, was the story of who he had been before. Dr. Holden Barrett had spent 11 years as a military physician, the last 4 of them attached to a forward-deployed emergency response unit in conditions that most civilian hospitals would not recognize as a medical setting. He had operated in tents, in vehicles, in the back of aircraft, in buildings with no power. He had made decisions with incomplete information under circumstances where the wrong answer meant someone died in front of him. He had been very good at it. His commanding officer, during his final deployment, had once told him that Holden possessed the rarest quality in emergency medicine: the ability to hold 2 contradictory clinical hypotheses in his mind simultaneously and test them both in real time without committing prematurely to either. Most doctors, the officer said, had one strong instinct and chased it. Holden chased the detail that didn't fit. That was what saved people in the field, where the easy diagnosis was usually wrong. He came back from his last deployment in the early autumn of a year when everything in his personal life was also fraying. His wife, Diane, had been managing a diagnosis of her own during the 2 years he was deployed, quietly, without alarming him, with the particular stubborn dignity that had been one of the things he loved most about her. By the time he was back on American soil and in the same room with her, there was less time left than either of them had understood from the letters. She died 14 months after he came home. Maisie was 3 years old. The professional collapse came separately and was more complicated. During a peer review at the military medical facility where he had been reassigned, Holden had documented what he believed was a serious procedural error by a senior physician that had led to a preventable death. He filed the report through the correct channels. He was careful, thorough, and factual. What followed was not an investigation. It was a slow erosion. Assignments reassigned, reviews delayed, colleagues who had been friendly becoming neutral and then distant. 6 months later, Holden resigned his commission. He was not asked to stay. He took a job driving a hospital shuttle for 8 months, then a maintenance role at a school district, then, eventually, the janitorial position at St. Marloe, which paid well enough, offered stable hours, and put him close enough to the medicine he had once practiced that he could maintain the habit of attention without the burden of responsibility. He told himself that was enough. Some mornings when he was making Maisie's breakfast and she was telling him about a dream she'd had or a song she'd learned at school, it actually was. Senator Preston Tate's condition changed on a Wednesday afternoon, 48 hours into his stay at St. Marloe. He had been sleeping in the VIP suite when his attending nurse, a composed woman named Diana Price, noticed a change in his monitors and paged Dr. Quinn immediately. By the time Sterling arrived with 2 residents and an attending cardiologist, the senator was conscious but clearly uncomfortable, a phrase that in medicine is a polite way of describing something that looks worse than uncomfortable and is heading somewhere nobody wants to follow. Sterling took control of the room with the efficient authority he always projected in high-visibility situations. He reviewed the monitors, asked the nurse for the most recent vitals sequence, and ordered a specific set of tests without pausing to consult the cardiologist beside him. There was a kind of choreography to the way he moved, coordinated, decisive, and entirely persuasive to anyone who did not know enough to look for what was missing. The two residents positioned themselves where he would see them being useful. Laurel Hayes, who had been called in from the floor below, stood at the edge of the room and watched. The tests came back inside of 15 minutes. Sterling reviewed the results and gave the team a working diagnosis with the confidence of a man reading from a prepared text. The cardiologist nodded. The residents took notes. The medications were ordered and administered. Sterling spoke briefly with one of the senator's aides waiting in the hallway, assuring him that everything was proceeding as expected and that the senator would be comfortable within the hour. What Sterling did not say, because he did not yet know, was that the senator was not improving. The clinical markers they were watching moved in small, stubborn increments that none of the treatments were addressing. An hour after the first round of medication, the monitors were telling the same story they had been telling before, only now with slightly more insistence. Sterling returned to the room and ordered adjustments. The cardiologist offered a secondary hypothesis. Sterling listened, waited briefly, and stayed with his original position. In the hallway outside, Holden Barrett was pushing his cart toward the service elevator and noticed that the door to the VIP suite was opening and closing more often than it had before. He stopped his cart and stood very still. He could hear fragments of the exchanges through the half-open door. The quick, efficient shorthand of a team working hard but not yet alarmed enough to slow down and question their direction. Holden had spent enough years in emergency medicine to know the difference between a team that was managing a problem and a team that was managing the appearance of managing a problem. What he heard from the hallway had begun to sound like the second thing. There was a specific phrase that stopped him. One of the residents mentioned a particular response pattern in the senator's vitals, and Sterling answered without hesitation in a way that confirmed his original hypothesis. Holden heard it, and something in the back of his mind pulled tight, the way a knot tightens when you pull one end and the other end holds. He had seen that response pattern before. Not in a conference room, not in a textbook, in the field, in a vehicle with bad lighting, in a man who turned out to have something entirely different from what the first set of symptoms suggested. He moved his cart to the wall and walked to the nurse's station, where Laurel Hayes was updating a log. He picked up a notepad from the edge of the desk and wrote 4 words on it. He slid the notepad toward her. Laurel looked at it. She looked at Holden. She looked back at the notepad. Something in her expression shifted, not to conviction, but to the particular alertness of someone who has been carrying a small uncertainty and has just been handed a possible explanation for it. Before she could respond, Sterling stepped out of the suite and saw them. He looked at Holden, then at the notepad, then at Holden again. His expression did not change dramatically, but his voice did. He told Holden that the VIP floor was not part of his cleaning assignment and that he needed to return to his designated area immediately. He told Laurel that the team had the situation well in hand and that outside observations were neither required nor appropriate. Then he went back into the room. 2 orderlies were passing in the hallway. One of them glanced at Holden with the mild curiosity of someone watching something that does not yet know it is about to matter. Holden stood in the hallway alone for a moment. He thought about Maisie's drawing on the refrigerator, the one from 2 weeks ago that had shown the two of them standing in front of what appeared to be a mountain, though she had told him it was their house. He thought about the last time he had filed a report in good faith and what it had cost him. He pushed his cart toward the elevator. He pressed the button. He waited. Through the wall, he heard a monitor alarm begin to sound. The sound was specific. Not the routine alarm that gets silenced in 20 seconds, but the kind that brings people running from 2 hallways away. Holden heard the footsteps first, then voices rising, then the particular controlled urgency that medical teams use when controlled urgency is all they have left. He turned his cart around and walked back toward the suite. The door was open. He could see the full room now. Sterling at the head of the bed, the cardiologist on the other side, 2 nurses moving with precision, 1 resident holding a crash cart and looking at Sterling for instruction that wasn't coming fast enough. Holden walked in. Nobody stopped him immediately because in the first seconds of a genuine emergency, nobody is watching the door. He moved to the edge of the room and spoke in a voice that was completely level. "You're working from the wrong assumption," he said. The room did not go quiet all at once, but it went quiet quickly, the way a room goes quiet when someone says something in the wrong register at the wrong time. Sterling looked at him. The expression on his face moved from irritation to incredulity in about half a second. "Get him out of here," Sterling said to no one and everyone. Holden did not move. He kept his eyes on the monitor and said the specific thing he had seen, a pattern in the response sequence that placed the senator's presentation in a different clinical category than the one Sterling had committed to 2 hours earlier. He said it plainly, without embellishment, without drama. He said it the way a person says a true thing they have checked twice. Laurel Hayes, standing near the crash cart, heard it and looked at the monitor, and then looked at Holden with an expression that was not disbelief. "I noticed the same discrepancy an hour ago," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the room was quiet enough that everyone heard her. Sterling turned toward her. The cardiologist looked at the monitor. One of the residents stepped back from the crash cart in a way that suggested he was reconsidering something. Sterling stood very still for a moment. The monitor continued its urgent rhythm. The senator's color was not good. Every protocol Sterling had followed had been correct for the diagnosis he had made. The diagnosis was the problem. He looked at Holden Barrett, at the gray uniform, at the St. Marlowe logo, at the man inside the uniform who was standing at the edge of his resuscitation bay, with the absolute calm of someone who had been here before, in worse rooms, with less equipment, and had not been wrong. What happened in the following minutes did not involve speeches or confrontations. It involved Sterling Quinn making the decision, the correct decision, the only remaining decision, to test the alternative. He ordered the specific confirmatory assessment Holden had indicated. The results came back in under 4 minutes. The cardiologist looked at them and said quietly that the new reading changed the picture significantly. Sterling absorbed this without speaking. He issued a revised directive. The team moved. Holden stayed near the wall. He did not give additional instructions. He did not take over. When one of the nurses looked at him for guidance, he directed her back to the attending physicians with a small gesture. This was not his room, and he understood what it would mean to act as though it were. He had come in to correct one wrong turn. The rest was theirs to drive. The senator's vitals began to respond within 15 minutes of the revised protocol. Not dramatically. Medicine rarely offers the dramatic recovery of a single decisive moment, but measurably, in the way that a vehicle that has been heading in the wrong direction begins to slow and then reorient. The monitor alarm stepped down from its most urgent register. Sterling watched the numbers and did not speak. The cardiologist made a notation in the chart. Laurel Hayes released a breath she had been holding, without knowing she was holding it. When it was clear that the senator had stabilized, the room began to depressurize. People moved with less urgency, spoke in lower voices, resumed the quieter work of monitoring and documenting. Sterling stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, looking at the senator's face, which had regained some of its color. Then he turned and looked at Holden Barrett, who had not moved from the wall near the door. For a moment, neither of them said anything. What had happened was sitting in the middle of the room between them, large and unambiguous. A man in a gray janitorial uniform had walked into a resuscitation in progress and identified the error that a department chief and a cardiologist had not found. The senator was alive in a way that he might not have been. These were facts, and facts, once they happen, have a way of refusing to be argued with. Sterling Quinn turned and walked out of the suite without a word. The two residents exchanged a glance. Laurel Hayes looked at Holden with something she would later describe to a colleague as the most complicated gratitude she had ever felt. Gratitude that existed alongside a deep, uncomfortable question about how long the system had been failing to listen. In the hour that followed, Sterling attempted to contain the event the way a man attempts to contain water with his hands. He briefed Celeste Mercer with a version of events in which the team had identified a secondary clinical pathway, and Holden's presence had been coincidental. A maintenance worker who had wandered into a crisis and repeated something he had overheard from the medical staff. Celeste listened to this account in her office with the expression of a person who is hearing one story and simultaneously reading a different one. She asked 3 clarifying questions. The answers to all 3 pointed away from Sterling's version and towards something considerably more interesting. Laurel Hayes gave a different account to the charge nurse, who gave it to the floor supervisor, who put it in writing before end of shift. 2 of the residents spoke to each other in the break room and did not attempt to hide what they had seen. By morning, the story that was circulating among the nursing staff at St. Marloe Medical Center was not a story about a coincidental observation. It was a story about a janitor who walked into a room full of doctors and told them they were wrong, and turned out to be right, and did it quietly, without anger, as though he had done this kind of thing before. Celeste ordered a review of Holden's personnel file that evening. What she found was thin in the way that files are thin when someone has deliberately provided the minimum required information. His employment history was partial. His references were institutional rather than personal. His medical knowledge column had been left blank, which was, on reflection, conspicuous in a way she should have noticed years ago. There was one document that did not fit the others, a service record notation from a military medical administrative office, stamped and dated, referencing a deployment review and a commendation. The name on it was Dr. Holden Barrett. Whitney Boone had covered healthcare policy for 11 years and had a particular talent for stories that lived at the intersection of institutional behavior and human cost. She heard about the St. Marloe incident through a source who had been present in the building that afternoon, and she began making calls the same evening. By morning, she had confirmed the broad outlines of what had happened. By noon, she had pulled a set of records from a military medical archive she had used in a previous investigation. The records contained the service history of a physician named Dr. Holden Barrett, who had been one of the most decorated field surgeons in his unit during a period that included a major civilian disaster response in which he had personally managed triage for over 40 patients in a collapsed structure with minimal equipment. The record also contained a reference to an internal conduct review and a subsequent resignation, the kind of sequence that Whitney had seen before and knew how to read. A physician who had done something that made powerful people uncomfortable, been neutralized through process rather than cause, and then disappeared from the system. She ran the date of birth against the employment records at St. Marloe. She compared a physical description from the military record to what two nurses had described to her over the phone. She found a reference to a scar on the right forearm from a field procedure, the kind of identifying detail that shows up in medical records and nowhere else. One of the nurses she spoke to said yes, she had noticed it. Whitney sat with her notes for a long time and then began writing. Not the story she had originally expected to write about a healthcare conference and a senator's medical scare. Something larger and more important and harder to dismiss. Gideon Hart drove to St. Marloe Medical Center the morning after the incident, having heard Holden's name in a context he had not expected to encounter again. He was 61 years old, retired from the military for 4 years, and had spent those 4 years working in civilian emergency medicine consulting. He walked into Celeste Mercer's office without an appointment, introduced himself, and placed a military service dossier on her desk. He told her he would need 15 minutes of her time. She gave him 30. He had been Holden's commanding officer for 2 years during the forward deployment. He described Holden Barrett as the most technically precise emergency physician he had ever supervised. Not the fastest, not the most aggressive, but the most accurate, which in the field was the quality that translated most directly into survival rates. He spoke about the incident that had ended Holden's career with a flatness that suggested it still sat badly with him, a senior officer's procedural error, a patient who did not survive, a junior physician who followed protocol by reporting it and was then made to understand that the protocol had limits. Gideon had tried to intervene. He had not been effective. It was the failure in his career that he had thought about most often in the years since. He also told Celeste about a flooding disaster response 6 years earlier, a civilian event in a rural county where Holden had been working as a transport driver and had arrived at the emergency staging area and spent 14 hours doing field triage. Because there were not enough medical personnel and he could not watch people die waiting for help that was not coming. He had not identified himself as a physician. He had not asked for credit afterward. The county emergency director had tried to find him for a commendation. By the time they located his name, he had already moved on. Celeste listened to all of this without interrupting. When Gideon finished, she sat quietly for a moment and then said that she would like to speak with Holden Barrett directly. Gideon said that sounded like a good idea, and that whoever spoke to him should understand they were speaking to someone who had made a deliberate choice to step back from the world, and that the choice deserved to be respected even as they asked him to reconsider it. Sterling Quinn spent the day after the incident preparing his defensive position with the same methodical attention he brought to his clinical work. He drafted a memo to Celeste's office framing Holden's entry into the VIP suite as an unauthorized breach of protocol that had created liability exposure for the hospital. He cited 3 internal regulations. He attached the relevant passages. He was careful and thorough, because Sterling Quinn was always careful and thorough, and because he understood that the story being told in the hallways of St. Marloe Medical Center was a story in which he did not emerge well, and that the only leverage he had was procedural. He also made a quiet inquiry through his assistant about the status of Holden's employment contract and whether there was a termination pathway that could be completed without a full review board. This inquiry was not as quiet as he believed it to be. The assistant, a young woman named Paula who had worked at St. Marloe for 3 years and had a strong personal sense of proportion, mentioned it to a colleague during lunch. That colleague mentioned it to the floor supervisor. The floor supervisor told Laurel Hayes. By early evening, Whitney Boone's phone had received a message. Whitney called Celeste's office directly and identified herself and her publication. She explained that she was preparing a piece about the events at St. Marloe, and that she would be including the question of how the hospital intended to treat the person who had identified the error. She was polite and specific. She said she would give Celeste 48 hours to respond. Celeste hung up the phone and looked out her office window at the parking lot for a long time. Then she called Sterling Quinn and told him the memo was not going forward. He argued. She listened to his argument, acknowledged its procedural logic, and told him the answer was still no. Senator Preston Tate was awake and oriented by the following morning, and when his aide briefed him on what had occurred, he did not speak for a long time. He had been in politics for over 20 years and had developed the particular ability of experienced public figures to absorb information without showing their first reaction. But what he was told, that the person who had identified the critical error was a janitor, a man in a gray uniform who cleaned floors at the hospital where the senator was receiving VIP treatment, reached him in a place that his political instincts did not quite cover. He asked to meet the man. His aide was uncertain about the optics. The senator said he did not care about the optics. When Holden Barrett was brought to the room, still in his work uniform, having come directly from his shift, carrying the slight awkwardness of a person who does not know what to do when institutional attention is suddenly pointed at them, Senator Tate looked at him for a moment and then said he wanted to thank him. Simply, plainly, without the verbal infrastructure that usually surrounded the senator's public statements. Holden said it was the right thing to do. The senator said he understood that, and that his concern was not about whether it had been right, but about what it meant that a man with that kind of capability was working in that capacity. He said he knew the name Holden Barrett, not from St. Marloe, but from an old file that had crossed his desk years ago during a military oversight review. A file about a physician who had done the correct thing and been penalized for it. He had not been able to act on it at the time. He said he was sorry for that. When the senator spoke to the 2 journalists who had gathered in the hallway, he said something that was reproduced widely in the days that followed. He said that a medical institution worthy of public trust could not be in the business of deciding whose observations matter based on the color of their uniform. He said it as a statement of fact rather than an indictment, which made it land harder than an indictment would have. Celeste Mercer, standing nearby, received it the way a person receives something they have needed to hear for a long time and would have preferred not to hear in public. Celeste called the emergency board meeting herself 3 days after the incident. She framed it not as a disciplinary proceeding, but as an institutional review, which was an important distinction. The board members arrived with the mildly wary energy of people who have been told a situation requires their attention and are not yet sure how bad the situation is. Sterling Quinn arrived last and sat at one end of the table with the stillness of a man conserving resources. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Laurel Hayes gave a statement about the culture of the unit, her language measured and precise and devastating in the way that measured and precise language often is. 3 other nurses gave written statements about a pattern of ignored observations, corrected assessments, and small daily discouragements of a kind that individually might be dismissed, but collectively painted a picture that was hard to argue with. One of the residents from the night of the incident provided a timeline that aligned with Laurel's account in every important detail. Sterling spoke in his own defense with intelligence and composure. He made legitimate points about procedural authority and the risks of untrained intervention in medical emergencies. Several of those points were valid in isolation. The problem was that the event they were reviewing was not an isolated abstraction. A specific person had made a specific observation that a specific team had missed, and the person was a janitor, and the team had been led by the man currently, explaining why the janitor should have stayed in the hallway. Celeste announced the board's decision at the end of the meeting. Sterling Quinn would be placed on administrative leave pending a full performance review and a mandatory review of the unit's consultation culture. The review would be conducted by an independent body. Additionally, the hospital would establish a formal patient safety observation program, a structured channel through which any employee, regardless of role, could flag a clinical concern and receive a response within a defined time frame. She said the program would need someone to help design its protocols, someone who understood both the clinical and the human dimensions of what it meant to be ignored in a place where being heard could save a life. Holden heard about the board's decision from Laurel Hayes, who told him in the hallway outside the service elevator on his way to the parking lot. He listened without changing expression. He thanked her. He pushed his cart to the storage room, signed out, and drove home to pick up Maisie from school. He sat with Celeste the following Tuesday in her office. She explained the patient safety program and why she wanted his involvement. She was direct about what the role would entail and what it would not. She did not dress it up. She said the hospital had failed in a particular way for a long time, and she wanted to change that, and she thought he was in a unique position to help. She also told him that the state medical licensing board had been contacted and that there was a pathway, if he chose to take it, to restore his license to practice. She said she was not pressuring him toward anything. She just wanted him to know the door existed. Holden looked out the window for a moment. Then he said yes to the safety program. He said he would think about the license. He said he had conditions, that the program would genuinely include housekeeping staff, dietary workers, transport drivers, the people who moved through the building all day and saw things that the people sitting in offices did not see. Celeste said those were the exact conditions she had hoped he would name. He nodded once, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected but needed to check. He did not want the story that had been building around him. He did not want the profile pieces or the speaking invitations or the version of himself that was being constructed in other people's retellings. He wanted to make Maisie's breakfast in the morning and pick her up in the afternoon, and occasionally, if the situation called for it, tell the truth in a room full of people who had decided not to. By winter, St. Marloe Medical Center was not the same institution it had been in October. The change was not dramatic or sudden. Institutional change rarely is, but it was real, and it showed in the small behavioral shifts that accumulate into culture. The patient safety program went live in November with 22 enrolled staff members from across all departments. By the end of its first month, it had received 14 observations, 2 of which had led to verified procedural adjustments. Celeste announced the results at a staff meeting and attributed them without hesitation to the person who had helped design the intake process. The nursing staff on the 4th floor began holding brief end-of-shift reviews that did not exist before. Residents who had been trained to look to their attending for all direction began to develop the habit of asking the nurses what they had noticed. Small changes, easy to underestimate, carrying the slow cumulative weight of a culture that has been told its listening matters. Holden Barrett still walked the same hallways. He was no longer assigned the night shift. He had asked to move to the afternoon rotation to be home in time for dinner, and the request had been approved without discussion. When he passed people in the corridors now, they called him by his name. Not always, not every person, but enough that the difference was noticeable. Some of the residents who had been on duty the night of the senator's crisis went out of their way to stop and speak to him, not because they were required to, but because they seemed to need to. He still carried the small notebook in his shirt pocket. He still wrote in it sometimes. One evening in December, a few minutes before the end of his shift, he stopped in the corridor outside the fourth-floor suite and stood at the window for a moment. The room inside was different now. Different patient, different evening, different configuration of equipment. The hallway was quiet. He stood there for a while, not with any particular expression, not performing anything for anyone. He was just a man looking through a window at a room where something had been decided about what kind of person he was willing to be when it mattered. He had not needed to prove he was better than anyone. He had only needed to decide that silence, in that specific moment, was a cost he was unwilling to pay. Maisie had a drawing on the refrigerator this week that showed a figure in a gray uniform standing very tall, arms wide, with the sun drawn large and yellow directly above. Holden had looked at it that morning for a long time. He thought it was probably the most accurate thing anyone had ever drawn of him.